Today I'm responding to one of my favorite YouTubers, as it were, Noel. He commented on one of PZ Meyer's videos titled The League of SJW Supervillains. And I'm going to try to snip out the comments so that you guys can just see his full comment context. I just left something saying briefly, it is as if you tell people everything is meaningless. They act like everything is meaningless beyond their brief hedonic pleasure. Maybe there is meaning to our existence beyond the dopamine circuit. And Noel actually had quite a few interesting things to say here that I didn't want to just respond to in the comment section, but actually make a little video about. I thought it was worthwhile. As I think whilst PZ and I disagree on this, we'd both agree that the non-existence of a God makes no difference in terms of attaching meaning to existence. I suppose a deity may knock the explanatory level back one, but it only forestalls the issue. It doesn't solve it. This gets a little tricky at this point because there's so much there kind of to talk about and so much presupposition that goes into that I think probably in some of my prior videos that I go into talking about God and meaning and how that's important. But the short of it is that when you're talking about meaning, you're talking about symbolic language. And you have to, I don't know of any other word to use other than God when you're talking about meaning. Mainly because what acts as the meaning in your life, whatever you have chosen or not chosen, which is still a choice, dictates how you see yourself, how you interact, how you judge yourself even, and it acts like God in that sense. So whatever you pick as your meaning or don't pick by default, that's what seems to affect what you see and how you interact with the world. And I know of no other way to describe that other than to use the word God, because that is the kind of the ultimate part of that we get in touch with. And he says that, knocking a deity out and knocks it back explanatory level back one, but it forestalls it, it doesn't solve it. I think the problem is that when you knock God out, you knock out the symbolic language, you knock out religion and all that history that went behind that, and you discount it, which is what mainly atheists do for the most part. Although I've seen recently, I guess some of them are coming around, like we see Noel here. Actually, it seems like he might have come around just a little bit to see some use for religious language. But it really does, you can't talk about value, you can't talk about meaning in any sense other than to say it's entirely subjective and what you believe is meaning is that, and that's all there is to it, which I don't think is true at all, actually, and I'll give some thought behind that. However, he does go into explanation of Hinduism, which shows the infinite, and this was interesting. I'd actually like to see him explain this a little bit more. I'm not a student of Hinduism, I just know a little, briefly about it, but it does seem to, also, he talks about the three, Brahma, Vishnu, Shiva, which is kind of corresponding to the Trinity of Christianity as well. So I'd just say that perhaps there's a little bit of overlap there. We often do see that too in mythology, that there are several cornerstones, like the most famous being the hero's journey, but in cultures that seem to come about. And I don't think that happens randomly. I don't think that most cultures have a hero's journey or have this three-part God level that is just pure happenstance. That there might be more to it if you look into it. Obviously, I do think there's more to it, but just saying from a purely outside perspective, nobody knows. You think, all these cultures seem to have these similar concepts coming up. Maybe we should take a look at that and see what the use or utility or value of them might be. So I would like actually him just to do maybe a 20-minute video on just this Hinduism that he's talking about and what actually appeals to him, because it doesn't seem to actually, like the way he presents it here in the comment, that kind of applies to Christianity as well in a way. Not the morally perhaps neutral part, but the rest of it. So he says the Abrahamic appeal straight to this transcendent perfect entity as adding meaning seems naive. It's akin to a small boy seeing infinity as a number a little bit bigger than 100, failure to grasp the magnitude and nature of the claims being made regarding his nature. Literally nothing we can do can change the unchangeable in any way, nor can any action serve a purpose for it being defined in such a way. This is a very odd concept that you have to be able to affect the infinite to have any meaning, I don't even understand why he's going there, because obviously if you're talking about an omnipotent being, an infinite being, and we're just this finite sliver of it, well, I don't know if we would even want to necessarily affect something like that, or even could, but certainly it can still affect us because we have this small sliver of our finite life that we get to see the infinite in. So, for example, if we look at all the experiences of every human that's ever existed, from birth to death, we only get a small sliver of that. Some for good and some for bad. So we get some of the good things. Maybe we get married and have kids, and we find meaning in that. And also the bad things. Perhaps a family member passes away. We're struck with illness or severe chronic illness for a meaningful long part of our lives that really impacts us severely in our mobility, maybe cognitive function. Okay, but that is a small sliver of the infinite that you get to experience. And we're each trying to add, hopefully in a positive way, to make things a little bit better along the way. That's kind of the goal, I think, that most of us can agree on. That we're trying to make things better so they're not as bad as they were before. And we have this small, finite time and even location and ability, context to our time, purpose, and place that we can use to get in touch with that infinite. And as far as affecting the infinite, I don't really understand how he's putting that go, but certainly you realize in your own personal life that you can move things for the better or for the worse. You can make decisions, and usually there's more decisions that can make things worse, obviously, than can make things better. So we have to be able to discriminate and describe these situations and have some sort of feedback process to it that we can use to adjudicate where we're going. I also find it odd because if you use Noel's logic, then why would we ever try to land on the moon? Why did human beings ever try to fly? Trying to fly was foolish and silly and dumb for 10,000 years, so to speak. But it eventually did happen. We eventually built planes. We could fly through the air. Eventually we could even go into space. So trying to aim far and we never know when something silly is going to be useful or something ridiculous. So I don't see like this magnitude of nature, the claims being regarding his existence. I mean, the idea of flying to the moon and coming back was, before 1900 or 1950 maybe even, or 1940s, was just fanciful flight, fairy tales. It was fiction. It was just purely fantasy. It was not realistic at all. But then we eventually did have it happen. We got a further chunk along in that slice of that infinite. And we can only do that by recognizing that there is the infinite. If you don't realize that that's out there, that there's even a possibility of that. So I'm not, Noel seems to be, I don't know, I don't want to go too far into this, but he seems to be very much of controlling. Like, I have to have control of this, otherwise I don't like it and I don't want it. So I don't know if that's like a little bit of a personal personality that's coming through on this, that I don't like the concept of this God because he's infinite and I can't affect him, and I don't like that and I can't understand it, or I'm not allowed to understand it. Maybe he feels that way about it. I'm not really sure. But here he says the last thing: if your God gives you meaning, then fine, but understand this is occurring subjectively in your head the same way as anything I insist gives my life meaning. And again, I find this extremely odd comment, because the subjective things in our head do affect our lives and those around us. And I don't see why it's subjective, because it does affect the world and affect yourself and people around you. And like we already discussed, obviously there's a lot of things that you could decide in your head and then act on them that would make the world a worse place. You could also, subjectively, obviously do the opposite. And that's how we kind of, I think, progress as human beings. We act on these abstract concepts. We put them into action in the world, and we see what happens. So if Noel decides that a good way to show his wife his love is to buy her flowers and candy, and that seems to reinforce their love, well, that was good feedback. But if it doesn't, then, right, we got to go back. We got to see what went wrong here. Maybe she thinks that he's trying to buy her off because he made her mad or something, right? I mean, this is part of living life as a human, is this give and take and looking back and trying to find the patterns that will make things better at this moment in time. As a secondary thing that I don't understand either is, like, let's take a mathematical equation. F equals ma, force equals mass times acceleration. Okay, well, can we point to that in the world? Where does that exist? Well, no, you can point out its effects, but there's, F equals ma is not written on an atom, so to speak. It's not actually there. It's in our heads, but acting on that will give you a certain result depending on the time and situation that you may find useful or not useful, right? Even if you were to wipe off all human beings and all our books that have F equals ma, would that formula still have any significance or meaning or use in the universe? Would it just not exist if people don't exist? Because that's kind of what he's saying when he's saying it's subjective in your head. It just doesn't have any. And it's the same thing with moral, so to speak, laws, formulas on how we act in the world. If I, show, I guess, like the easiest one is the log. Don't point out the log in your neighbor's eye when you have an even bigger one in yours. Trying to show a bit of respect and humility, and pointing out the faults of others because we have many faults of our own. If you act on that in the world as a moral formula, you will get a certain result. And I'm not even saying that it's the person, because certainly with Christianity, it's a living, working religion that you actually have to do. It's not just in your head. You actually have to act it out, and you will get certain results, and those will make things better or worse. And that's kind of what you judge, how you're doing as a human being. The things that we do, the things that we put out into the universe, what happens? If you act on that law, so to speak, that formula, don't judge others, lest you yourself be judged. If you act on that and things get worse in your personal life, in your loved ones, and those around you, well, then that's a time to go back and reflect and see, did I interpret it wrong? Is it just bad formula? Maybe this was worked at one time. It's not working right now. But and you could do that with any, moral lesson, if you want to call it that, or moral formula. And I'm not saying that all of them are going to be perfect in any sense, form, or fashion, but you have to act it out. And they're not subjective, because things will happen. Just like if you decide the only thing that's important is that I feel good. I want to feel good. Hedonism. And you go and act that out in the world. There will be consequences for acting that out. And that does act like that is your God, the God of hedonism, the God of nihilism. And there will be consequences for that. Pursuing truth. If you really do that, there are consequences for that. You will get feedback. Will it make your life, those around you, and in a larger sense than the world, a better place or a worse place? Now, this is where we go back to something that he said about, also I feel something that's missing in this talking to the infinite, so to speak, that Noel seems to think is silly, is that Christianity at least, from what I understand, views it as a very personal relationship with God, that it's your thing, right? No one knows who goes to heaven but God. He's the only judge. So you may just be this finite, small grain of sand, an infinite sea of sand, right? But you do have just a touch of this infinite that you can try to grasp and try to get a hold of, to try to live out. But when you put this into action, something does come back. And what it is personal responsibility. That you are responsible in almost an infinite manner, which is really hard, difficult on a person. but that your actions actually do matter. They are so important. In some ways, your actions are the most important thing for that person. And by that, I mean the most meaningful things, because you have to live with those forever, and your descendants have to live with those forever, just like we have to live with the decisions of those that came before us, good and bad, forever. And so at the same time, it makes you feel like you're this small, infinite, or finite rather, little critter, but you have this unreasonable level of influence. And by that I mean, if you take someone moderately intelligent like Noel, I'm sure if Noel actually put his head to it and really thought about how he could make things worse, he could make things in his country, actually, perhaps even around the world, really bad. If you really sit there and think about it, you know what? Let's burn it all. I'm going to be really smart about this. I'm going to think about how I can make things so bad for everyone. And I don't even really want to go into that speculation that much, because in some ways I feel like it's courting danger a little bit to talk about it, like out loud, to put it out there, because people think like shootings, like public shootings or stabbings, while they certainly are horrific, if those people actually wanted to cause more horror, if they used a bit more thought, they could do things that were way worse. And certainly the more intelligent you are, you can come up with more ideas to make things really bad. One example, I guess, would be like the Boston bombers. And they weren't even smart, but, they managed to create a horrific amount of injury with not even that much intelligence, but a little bit more intelligence than, I guess, the average, chaos maker, as it were. So because of that, the downward trend is so awful and so easy and so apparent. I mean, it's really easy for things to get worse around us. You just don't have to do anything. Don't clean the litter boxes out. All it takes is a couple of days of that, and you have a huge mess, right? Don't take the trash out. Things get worse. So we have this horrible contradiction where we are this small, finite, insignificant creature, yet we have also a huge amount of ability to make things worse. And then we have this small sliver, just this small little sliver, that we can actually make things better. And that's a awful amount of responsibility and horror, because I honestly don't think people want to think that their lives are necessarily that meaningful, that anything they do, it doesn't really matter. But that's not true. That is simply not true. And I lay this as evidence because if you really thought about it, get in touch with those dark thoughts and sides, you could make things horrific. I mean, one person could literally start a world war. It is possible. That's horrible. That's awful to think that you could have that much effect on meaning in the world, for everyone's meaning. But then you can also make things better. It's just that it's really hard to make things better. And I think that's in part why we have so many, such a history of moral laws and moral thought. Something else that I would like to bring up, and this is kind of an aside, it doesn't really deal with it here, but it's a frequent thing that I see brought up, is that everyone wants to litigate all the bad from a certain religion, say. But that's not right. It would be like if I went to you and said, I'm going to ask your spouse everything that you do that irritates them, right? And it doesn't matter how good you are, right? We all do things that irritate our spouses, right? They can list those. Let's say there's 5 things. You're impatient, you're annoying, you don't listen very well, you pick your nose. Okay. Then I say, well, look at that list. You need to get rid of them. That's just no good. They're annoying. They pick their nose. They're quick to anger. That's no good. But then they say, well, but they got all these good things. No. I can't hear the good things. Nope. There are bad things here. There are things that you don't like. It's all got to go. And that is a ridiculous way, absolutely ridiculous way to look at religion. But that's what I often feel that atheists do. They want to list just the bad. And when you especially look at a religion like Christianity, or Judaism, or anyone that's been around for, like 1,000 years. I mean, of course, there's going to be a whole litany of lists. It's just like if I were to ask you, okay, up till you were 5 years old, list all the bad things you did. Or, you ask your parents, since you wouldn't remember necessarily. Okay, so you list a couple of bad things you did. Okay, well, that's not too bad, right, at 5. Most people can't do too many bad things up to age 5. What about 10, 20, 90? That list is going to get longer of things that you've done wrong. Even if you're trying to be a good person, I mean, you're just going to do some things wrong sometimes. Whether it's due to lack of information, or you just didn't have the insight, or you got past the situation and look back and be like, oh my God, now I understand. Like sometimes, humans, unfortunately, we're not wise enough to avoid making the same mistakes that those before us have made. I wish we were, because that would be a really easy way to make things better. That if our kids didn't make any of the mistakes we made, sure, they made their own new mistakes, but they didn't make any of those old mistakes. They didn't have to repeat those. That would be like, oh my God, okay. It would only take a couple generations and things would start getting really good. But it doesn't really work like that, really. Hopefully they can just not make maybe one of the mistakes that we made, right? So that's not an even-handed view, because you're not looking at the positives, right? And I don't think you should, calculate your relationship up necessarily like that. I'm just kind of giving an example of kind of the way that you have to look at everything that you're getting out of a situation to see if it's good, right? The good, the bad, and maybe just the, well, I don't really care about this much. Even the neutrals, because the neutrals can change. So, you have to take those into account. So that's what I would ask, is to look at the whole picture of religion, of whatever religion, or mythology, or fable, or moral idea, whatever you're looking at. Try to give a full view of it. Not just, I'm listing the things that I didn't like, gone. Well, no, that's ridiculous. You're never going to get that perfect situation of everything being there. As an aside, given our finite, limited nature, that we will never understand the full nature of the universe, the full nature of life, the full nature of everything. I guess you can also think of God in that way, that we put that box of the mysteries that we do not yet understand in a way. And you might say, well, but we know so much more now, so we don't need a mystery box anymore of the things that we don't understand. But it's kind of not true, because every time we discover something, we discover 10 more things we didn't know about, and then we have to investigate those, and those we discover 10 more things. So, certainly we do make a march of progress forward, and I'm certainly not advocating that God is the magical element box, but because of our finite, limited nature, we ourselves will never know it all. We will not understand it all. We will not be perfect. So we put that perfection, even the idea of the Platonic forms, perfection, truth, in that infinite category of God, so that we can attempt to get to the truth, even though we realize our finite nature. Thank you very much, Noel. I appreciate your contributions, and I'm glad to see that I think I made a critique a couple months back that I was getting really tired of your religious videos, anything to do with religion, because they were really bad, and I felt like you were just arguing from just terrible. You didn't even it's like making an argument for dinner when someone's trying to fix their car. It's like, whoa, this isn't even on the same page remotely. You're talking about dinner, and I'm trying to fix a car, and it's like, this is no good. So, but it does seem to be more getting to the meat of the matter a little bit. I do appreciate that, so thank you.